Okay, well, I've been covering the news since our last meeting, roughly a month each time we do this. And we'll start off with the suborbital space tourism. Now, we've talked about this in the previous meetings. The last one was right before these recent launches, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on these, but they did finally happen. Virgin Galactic launched first on July 11th, and this is a test. Basically, Richard Branson and 5 other employees, 2 of whom were pilots. Total ride about 90 minutes, but most of that is in the carrier aircraft that takes them up. You can see in the picture up here. Um, there's the rocket plane is kind of in the center. It's carried up by these, the 2 joined together planes. Then it blasts up, and at that point, the ride is actually fairly similar to what you'd get from Blue Origin. So you get about 3 minutes of weightlessness. They go about 53 miles up. So of course, there's some controversy on, well, exactly where does space start? We talked about that before, but that meets the U.S. Air Force definition anyway. The next test would be in September, with members of the Italian Air Force. They claim they have 600 reservations already, between $200,000 and $250,000 per seat. And now they said they'll take orders for new tickets starting next year at 450,000. So, those of you could have had a bargain if you just went in there a little sooner. Blue Origin launched shortly thereafter. That included Jeff Bezos, his brother, and also the oldest person to travel into space and the youngest person to travel into space. And that was about an 11-minute ride. That one's completely automated, no pilots. You'll also get about 3 minutes of weightlessness on that trip. And they go up to 66 miles. So that's more than the 62 miles that certainly everybody would agree is pretty much the start of space. Now, they also claim they have a big backlog. They say they've sold about $100 million for future flights. Going out a little further into low Earth orbit, the International Space Station. They got an upgrade, a pretty big one this time. This was launched by Russia, the Nauka Science Lab. That went up, it went up July 21st and arrived and docked on the 29th. This thing is pretty big. It's 44,000 pounds, about 43 feet long. And it's really the first large pressurized element to be added to the space station since 2011. There was a small one added, the Bigelow space thing we added later. But in terms of large elements, that's the biggest one in quite a while. The funny thing is, this thing has actually been in development for about 20 years. Originally, it was planned as a backup to the very first space station module. So that goes back to 1998 with the Zarya module, which was built by Russia, paid for by NASA. That launch, finally, they were going to do a slight variation on that. They were going to launch it in 2007, but that got delayed until now. This thing was about 5 times the mass of the old module that was in that same docking position. That had been there since 2001. So they had to get rid of that. They got rid of that on July 26th. They towed it off with one of their Progress cargo ships and burned it up in the atmosphere. It adds quite a bit. Because it is bigger, it added some new science areas. It adds a new sleeping compartment, which will be taken by Russian cosmonauts. It added a toilet and some oxygen generation. The other thing that went up with this particular launch was the European robot arm. And this is another relic in a way. It's a big one, 37 feet. It was built 15 years ago, but never delivered. There hasn't been enough in the way of lift capacity to get up to the space station to get things up as fast as people want it. This is kind of an extreme example of that. This one will be the first arm that can actually crawl all over the Russian parts of the station. There's another major robot arm up there that can crawl around from anchor point to anchor point on the western part of the station. But this will now allow the same thing to happen on the Russian side. The picture down below here shows you what it looks like. Once they get up into space, before they dock, they do deploy solar panels so they have power. They have radiators built into the thing. That's not quite enough. They're going to need more, but that's something they do by adding on with a spacewalk later on. There's docking points at either end. So on the left-hand side here, that's what docks with the space station. The right-hand side, in the future, there will be another module being added to there. And then there's also an airlock in the same general area. So here's what it looked like after docking. The Nauka's module is the one to the right here. In front of that is one of the Russian modules, and this is it's either a Progress cargo ship or as a Soyuz capsule for astronauts. I'm not sure. They look about the same except for a portal, and I'm not sure I can really tell which one that is. But anyway, that's what it looked like after installation. The picture down here in the lower right, this shows what it looked like on the inside. There's 2 Russian cosmonauts there. Now, there's a lot of stuff all packed up. It's going to take them quite a while to get this thing up and operational, but at least this is what it looked like when they first installed it. A little picture here giving you a feel for what's on the space station. The Nauka module is going here on the kind of left-hand side. In rough terms, the left-hand side of this diagram is Russian, the right side is Western, mainly US. So the Nauka module goes there, and they're showing a future hookup with a Soyuz craft for delivering astronauts, but that same docking port can be used for cargo as well. This particular drawing was done by the Europeans for the robot arm. So of course they emphasized there's where the robot arm initially goes. And then of course it can move around after that. And you know, some of the other things that show up here are things like the solar panels and so on. Now, there was unfortunately a major glitch. There was actually initially there was a glitch with during the flight, but the big one happened really after docking. They'd been docked in place for a little bit, and then they started firing a thruster for about 15 minutes. And this thing ended up rotating the space station 1.5 times. It made 1.5 complete revolutions. It was done slowly. They claimed that the astronauts wouldn't notice it. I think they would have noticed if they were looking out windows. So maybe it's good there aren't too many windows there. It did overwhelm the normal stabilization for the space station. The space station weighs about 1 million pounds. You know, once you get it moving, you know, it takes some time to fix it. They fought this for about an hour. There's thrusters on the Zvezda module, and also they also fired some thrusters on one of the Progress cargo ships to counteract the thrust until they finally could turn the thing off. It just so happened that when the thrusters on the Nauka started up, they were out of range of the Russian controls, and they didn't have a way to turn them off right away. So that's why it took them a while. It was a fairly exciting time. The NASA flight director was actually not even, he was just there kind of just to look at things. He was officially off duty, but he got involved in this really quickly. His quote was, the space station brought a knife to a gunfight. And yeehaw, that was a day. So he was, needless to say, that was more excitement than they were looking for. But everything is okay now. One thing it did impact was the Boeing Starliner launch. Now, a little background on that. There are 2 commercial crew contracts that NASA has let for taking astronauts to the space station. One goes to SpaceX, and of course they've already delivered astronauts. And the second one was to Boeing for the Starliner. And that's the capsule that you see in this picture right here. Using an Atlas V rocket, and then when it goes back to Earth, it comes down by parachute, drops into Mexico. They had a test in December 2019, and it failed to reach the space station. It went into the wrong lower orbit. And then they've reviewed this, and it turned out there were also some communications problems and some kind of a glitch that affected the thrusters. So a lot of work had to be done to reassure everybody that things were in place. They were finally all set to do a new test to take their cargo to the space station, but then the instability of the space station control hit. So they put that off. And as soon as that was over, then they discovered there was a separate problem with some valve, and they're still working on that one. So they have not announced the launch window. In fact, they've moved the whole assembly back into the building. Going a little further out to lunar news, a couple things here. One on the human landing system, which is getting astronauts to the moon, and the second one is some work researching in situ resource recovery on the moon. So the first one of those, now you probably remember back in April, NASA had awarded SpaceX a contract for getting astronauts down to the moon. So that's getting from lunar orbit down to the surface of the moon. Congress had put some pretty serious budget limits on that, and NASA finally concluded that they could only afford one, and they could barely afford that. SpaceX had the lowest bid on that, so they got it. And that was somewhat of a surprise, because originally it was assumed that there would be 2 competing contractors working on this, but they simply didn't have the money to do it. They wanted to move forward. Now, this was appealed by Blue Origin and Dynetics teams. There are 3 teams that are kind of suggested in this drawing right here. There's the Blue Origin team, which also teams up with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. Dynetics and then SpaceX, and these are showing roughly to scale what the solutions look like. Give you an idea of the differences between these. Anyway, so what happened was funding had to be stopped because of this appeal. And today, I mean, during this month, the Government Accountability Office, they concluded that the appeal should not be granted, so they rejected it. Now the project will move forward. Now, that's not to say that if more money isn't appropriated, then a second team could also be, empowered to, to also continue developing their lander. That's probably what will happen. Now, Jeff Bezos, who heads up Blue Origin, in what sounds like desperation, he's actually offered to forego $2 billion in payments for the next 2 years, and even add a test flight, and also guarantee fixed price for a future lander. So he really wants back in. They're a little behind. They definitely want back in. So he put an offer on the table for that. Has not responded officially to this yet. Okay, the other lunar news is, we had a helicopter on Mars. Well, now we're also talking about a drone on the moon. Now, in this case, obviously, a drone is not going to be a helicopter. It's purely going to be propelled, with thrusters. But NASA is funding a small project with Arizona State University, teamed up with Intuitive Machines, that's a Houston-based company. And their plan is to put what's essentially a drone there that can hop around, make it in several hops. It can go in and it can take pictures and temperatures, in particular, get a close-up look at what's inside some of the craters near the South Pole. That's about $41 million grant. And it's called a hopper lander. In the terms, the naming from Intuitive Machines, they call it a Micronova, drone on the moon. Now, this is going in December 2022. We're talking about something fairly imminent here. This is a year and a half away. So the drone itself is about 76 centimeters cubed. The right-hand side here shows you, kind of a big version of that. And if you look at the bottom, you can see there's some thrusters down there. The picture on the left shows the lander it would come with. Intuitive Machines is making this small hopper, but it's also making the lander as well. And these are landers for robotic landings. These are not anything to do with people. These are much smaller. This thing is about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, about 4 meters tall. They'll be getting there on a Falcon 9 rocket. And it'll take high resolution photos and also take temperatures inside the permanently shaded regions. Now, these are of quite a high interest because originally, people thought there wasn't a whole lot of water on the moon other than what's bound up in minerals, as oxygen only, not as water. But the permanently shaded regions, they are so cold and they stay cold because the sun never hits them. And it's thought that the ice that gets in there could stay there. And in fact, maybe even some ice that gets evaporated by the sun hitting the rest of the surface may migrate there. So it's quite likely the water has accumulated. This is the theory. And now we're going to go and take a look to see if that's really true. Now, another one is getting oxygen out of the lunar regolith, the dirt that's on the surface of the moon. This one is a joint venture between an Israeli company and a Japanese company. Helios has come up with a technology, as embodied in this picture down here on the right, for what's essentially electrolyzing the lunar regolith. From that, they would get the oxygen out of the minerals and also some metals. Now, oxygen is pretty important for a lot of reasons. Obviously, you need it for breathing. If you're going to be living in space, you want to have a source of oxygen, but also for being able to continue to travel outward, you need oxygen for propellant. And depending on the propellant, usually there is a propellant and the oxidizer. 70% of the total propellant weight, in a lot of cases, is the oxygen. So if you can actually produce that in situ, that is in place, you don't have to bring that from Earth. So there's a high value to this. There's a lot of oxygen in the regolith. They're claiming about 40%. Now they might additionally attempt to cast some of the metal that they extract into a mold. It's not as clear if that's actually going to happen or not. But if they did that, that would be the first human artifact actually produced on the moon, as opposed to just dropped there. Anyway, lots of people seem to be building these landers. We talked about one previously, and the one from ispace looks like this. It would be delivered. I'm not sure which rocket this is assumed. This might be actually delivered as one of the as an offshoot, a tag-along mission with one of the Artemis missions. I'm not sure where this one comes in. Moving further out into space, the Falcon Heavy has now officially been chosen for the 2024 Europa Clipper mission. Now, Europa is it's a moon of Jupiter, and it's interesting for a variety of reasons. It has an icy surface, and then underneath that is believed to be an ocean of water. And so, of course, there's as soon as you have that, you think, well, there's always a possibility of life. There's sources of heat there, sources of energy. Who knows, something might have happened there. Now, back in January, we had reported that the SLS, the Space Launch System, that had been dropped from consideration for this mission for a variety of reasons. One was the high cost, another was the schedule that had been delayed quite a bit. And also they found that there was a lot of vibration problems, and they really would have to end up redesigning the system. But one of the bigger problems was simply that even if they wanted to fly the SLS, the few that are being built are all dedicated to the Artemis moon program. So they weren't going to be available until later. There's a nice launch window in 2024 they wanted to hit. They finally, so they had decided to drop the SLS, but they never said, now what? Well, now they're saying what, and that what is that they're paying $178 million to SpaceX for their rocket. So that's going to save about $1 billion in what it costs for the SLS rocket. And they're estimating maybe another $1 billion in the redesign and testing and all that to fix the vibration problems. And all that, of course, would also likely be launch delays. Now, one disadvantage of the Falcon Heavy is that it's not as powerful as the SLS. So it will be a longer trip. It'll have to actually get some gravity assists along the way. It'll take about 6 years. The SLS approach, they could have just blasted right through in maybe 3.5 years. So that would be the one disadvantage. But on the other hand, if they couldn't make the takeoff time anyway, that helps mitigate that particular problem. Okay, so now we're at the point where we ask people to think about how many launches do you think there have been since the last meeting? Now, remember, a launch only counts here if it's attempting orbital or beyond. So all the suborbital flights, like from Blue Origin and so on, don't really count here because that takes a lot less energy to accomplish that. The picture shown here is the Proton rocket from Russia that did carry up that Nauka Science Lab. So that's a fairly current one. So I'll give you a few minutes. You should have a place on your screen to vote on how many launches you think there have been. I'll count down a few more seconds here. And I guess we'll end it. So it looks like most people voted 9 or 10. That was my hint from several months ago. It's about roughly half at 9 and maybe a quarter at 10, and one was somewhere else. Well, it turns out the right answer was 9. And here they are. We've already talked about the going to the space station on the Proton rocket from Russia. Nothing else that notable about this one, except notice one thing: only one of these launches was American. Most of them were Chinese. And in fact, the one American one is on Electron, which is really Rocket Lab, which is really still, for all practical purposes, is really still a New Zealand company. They've officially rehoused themselves in America, but they haven't actually finished any facilities in the US yet. So you could actually say there were almost no US launches, which is pretty unusual. Okay, since I've been doing these summaries of launches, I see lots of pictures of what these things look like when they take off. And I have to say, I'm going to give an award for the most scenic launch site. And that has got to be by far the Xichang Satellite Launch Center that's in Southwest China. The inset in the map in the upper left corner here kind of gives you an idea where that is. This place has been in operation since 1984. Now it's very scenic, but that means there's a price to be paid. These are very far inland, which means that when they launch rockets, they're going to drop boosters and they're going to drop the nose cones, the fairings, into inhabited areas. And that has caused protests in China. There's a reason they're all built inland. It isn't really because it's scenic. It's actually because they wanted to be sure that they were out of reach of the US Navy if things ever got ugly. So the early sites, in fact, were all very far inland, just like this one is. Now there are quite a few sites along the coast, which follows the practice of everybody else. This particular launch, which is one of the 9 I just mentioned, they are experimenting with guiding the fairings to a controlled landing site. So they're using a parachute. And there's a photo of it up here in the upper right-hand corner. That there's a parachute there, and that's actually just fairing is typically split into 2 when the payload is released. So that's probably just one of them. It wasn't clear if they did a second one or not. This was more experimental than anything else. Okay, well, with that, I will stop to see if anybody has any questions or wants to make any comments before introducing the main speaker.
That's a lot going on. Somehow I missed that whole thing about Helios. How did you find out about it?
It was one of those things where I was, how you get lost, you just sort of follow a story and then you follow, and somewhere along the line, it just ran across it. I couldn't even tell you at this point.
I was checking out them on LinkedIn, and I noticed I had actually interviewed one of the people associated with it with my countdown to the moon thing. They were part of Space IL, the X Prize moon group from Israel. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, well, that might be the Japanese company, ispace. They're the one, they advertise that. In fact, they show a picture of, they have a thing that looks kind of like the original moon lander, or the moon rover, I'm sorry, the one that was driven by the astronauts, but scaled down. So
Ian, sorry, I was going to say, Ian asked a question in the chat room. What are spy satellites, and do we know specifics of their missions?
Well, just in general, they're monitoring what's going on Earth. So, typically they might be radar based, or they might be, just taking pictures. So it's kind of generic. I mean, a more polite way of saying it is Earth observation satellites, because there's not much of a line between observing the Earth for commercial purposes. I mean, for instance, for looking at forest fires, or looking at, where growth has been, or looking for climate change damage, that kind of thing, versus just outright spying. But when they're launched by the military, we tend to call them spy satellites. So I think the main difference is simply, if it's launched by the military, you assume it's for spying. If it's launched for commercial purposes, then you assume it's just basically to sell data to whoever wants it.
Cool.
Okay, anything else? Okay, we'll move on to our featured speaker, Gitika Gorthy. You already heard she's the founder and CEO of Ignited Thinkers, which is an organization dedicated to educating people in space, and it's for everyone. She's also doing aerospace medicine research with Baylor and Brown universities. She is an intern at NASA Ames Center in their gene lab, a rocketry enthusiast, and she's a senior at a high school in Northern Virginia. So she'll talk about 3 things. The Ignited Thinkers work. She'll also talk about the aerospace medicine research. And I think something that might be of interest to many people also is what kind of career paths people have. Most people think of astronauts as being, the career path, and then maybe aeronautical engineer because they're designing rockets. But the reality is there's a lot more that needs to be done in space. I mean, life support alone requires every kind of engineering. But we'll find out what she has to say. So, Gitika, I'll turn it over to you.